Welcome to Murder by Nature, where we discuss true crime, mysterious disappearances, and unsolved cases. I'm Jasmine, your host. Now, we're going to dive into part 4 of the true story behind the Love and Death series on Max. In last week's episode, we dove into the murder of Betty Gore and the shocking details that unfolded. We left off on the police arresting Candy. Now, in this week, we're going to dive into the trial of Candy Montgomery and all of those details. As I said last week, please take caution in listening to this episode. Previously, I got a lot of bullying about the details that I go into, and this episode does go through a little bit more detail of the murder as they go into the trial, and Candy reenacts what happened. So please take that with caution. And with that, we're going to dive in to part 4, the final part of the true story behind Betty Gore's death. After Candy was arrested, news started flying with rumors. As soon as Candy was able to post bail, she did. And as soon as she got home, she decided that she was going to stop reading the newspapers and watching the TV. Unknowing to the Montgomerys, the community continued to support them. And when they discovered this, Pat was heartened by the way everyone just stood by them. No matter what new evidence was leaked to the press, the church had been overwhelmingly supportive. Rarely a day went by that they didn't receive at least half a dozen greeting cards and have a nice day cards and thinking of you cards. Some of them awkwardly worded, but all of them well-intended. People who hadn't written or seen the Montgomerys in years were visiting Hallmark stores all over America, trying to find a message suitable for a family awaiting a murder indictment. Candy wrote replies back to all of them. As Candy was waiting for the trial, she knew that she needed to have a lawyer that would be in her corner. And that's when Candy hired a lawyer she knew from church, Don Crowder, to represent her, to represent this case. And if you watch the docuseries, you kind of get an idea of who this guy is. He was a partner in a small firm with an Attorney General, Jim Mattox. Usually, he handled personal injury work. He wasn't a criminal defense lawyer and definitely had never been on a murder case before. And suddenly he had the hottest one in Texas on his hands. As he began to dive into the case, he realized he was going to need help prying the memories of that horrible June day out of Candy. And that's when he enlisted the aid of a Houston psychiatrist, Dr. Fred. He called himself the River Oak Shrink. He dealt with a lot of volume-added socialites and potential millionaires. Dr. Fred, he said he didn't mind that people knew that, though. It was his only advertising. That's why when Crowder called in early August, Fred quickly said he didn't care much for the courtroom work. It was bad PR. But when the attorney outlined the case, Fred was intrigued. He said that he can serve as a consultant and see the client once for a diagnosis. Candy and Crowder flew to Houston where they met Fred, and he administered a series of tests. And after Candy and Crowder flew back home, Fred pronounced that he was hooked on the case and he agreed to break into Candy's memory through hypnosis. Only 2 weeks later, Candy returned back to Houston, but this time she had one of her attorney's associates, Elaine. Elaine noticed that Candy seemed to be a little bit more disattached than usual. She was numb on the plane ride down. She kind of was just there. And as they waited in Fred's reception area, Candy grew even more vacant. Unsure of what to do or what happened as they waited, they just waited for him to arrive. And when he did, he offered a cheery greeting and then ushered Candy back into his office. Now, Candy felt comfortable with Dr. Fred. She found him to be businesslike yet playful at the same time. And it kind of helped with what she was going through. Now, after Candy disappeared, Elaine settled back in the chair and was flipping through old magazines. Hours were passing with no one coming or going, and she was starting to pace around, bored and wondering what was going on inside. And then suddenly she heard a blood-curdling scream. It was loud and eerie, and it came from Fred's office. Then she heard several more quickly, but those were low-pitched, like moans or noises people made when they're having nightmares. She couldn't really tell where they came from or if they were coming from Candy. And they didn't stop. Fred's voice got to Candy soft and deep and the source of his power and art. Fred was a psychiatrist, but he also knew that he was the first-rate clinical hypnotist, however you pronounce that. On this day, he began with a speech about the need to be completely open and leveled. Because if Candy wasn't, or if she didn't think that she could be, the interview was over. No, there's no question about that, she reassured him. All right, he said. I want you to start and tell me about what happened that day. Candy reluctantly began with the vacation Bible school and ended up telling him everything that happened that morning on Friday, June 13th. More than she told her attorney. More than Pat knew. Then they talked a long time about control, anger, and Candy's deep-seated unconscious fears. After a couple of hours, when Fred was sure that he had won the patient's trust, he decided hypnosis. Candy was remarkably susceptible to it. She went quickly under, and her hypnotic trance was deep. Fred's soothed, soft voice carried her far under until her body was completely relaxed. Then he took her back to Betty Gore's utility room. When I snap my fingers, he said, you'll begin to re-experience and relating the time to me as you go through it. 1, 2, 3. He snapped his fingers loudly. Begin what's happening, Candy. She said nothing. She looked worried. What's happening, Candy? You can tell me. He waited for a response that didn't come. What thoughts are going through your mind? I'm going to count to 3, and when I reach 3, your thoughts and feelings will get stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger. So strong you'll have to express them and verbalize them. 1, 2, stronger and stronger, so strong you'll have to get them out. 3, let them out. What are you feeling, Candy? Hate. Okay, you hate her. Express your feelings stronger and stronger. Candy whimpered. You hate her, repeated Fred. I hate her, she whimpered. You hate her. You hate her. Say it loud. I hate her. Louder. I hate her. She messed up my whole life. Look at this. I hate her. I hate her. When I count to 3, I want you to back up in time again, Candy. I want you to go back to a time when she shoved you. You're in the utility room and she shoves you. Just relax. 1, 2, 3. Candy whimpered and moaned slowly. What's happening? Go through it. The feeling is very strong. 1, 2, 3. She pushes you. Candy moaned again. What is she going to do? What's happening? Tell me. What is it? Candy tried to say something. What? Louder. I won't let her hit me again. I don't want him. She can't do this to me. The feeling's getting stronger, said Fred. Stronger. Candy simmered on the couch but didn't respond. Fred made her go deeper into the past, asking her to go back to the first time you ever got mad. Do you recall ever being this mad before? Do you recall it? No response. When you were little, let's go back in time. Let's get in that time machine and go all the way back when you were little. 1, back in time. 2, 3. The time machine stops. How old are you, Candy? 4. 4. Tell me about it. What made you so mad? I lost it. What did you lose? Race. You lost the race? To Johnny. Do you like Johnny? He beat me. What did he say when he beat you? No answer. How do you feel? Mad. Furious. What are you going to do? Break it. Break what? The jar. How did you break it? I threw it against the pump. Are you scared? Candy nodded. My mother took me to the hospital. What did your mother say? Shh. Did what? Shh. What did she say? Shh. When I count to 3, your feelings will be stronger and stronger. 1, 2, 3. What are you seeing? I'm afraid. What are you afraid of? Are you afraid of being punished for your anger? Is that what you're afraid of? It hurts. She rubbed her hand against her head. Your head hurts? What does it hurt? I'm scared. I want to scream. When I count to 3, you can scream all you want. 1, 2, 3. She shivered but made no sound. Just kick and scream all you want, said Fred. It's okay. It's okay to do it. Candy shrieked, an eerie wail that could be heard through 2 walls of Fred's office. It's all right, he said. Just kick and scream all you want. Candy was breathing hard. How do you feel when she shushed you? I'm afraid, and I'm going to kick and scream. When I count to 3, you're going to kick and scream all you want. 1, I can't. Yes, you can. 2, 3. Kick and scream all you want. She screamed even louder. It hurts, she yelled. then screamed again. As soon as she stopped, Fred thought it was wise to bring her out of the trance. It would take more interviews to sort out the details of Candy's childhood trauma, as well as the terrible, fatal struggle between Candy and her friend Betty. By the end of the first session, Fred had done what her attorney wanted him to do. He found the memory of her mother, perhaps ill-advised discipline at a painful moment that triggered Candy Montgomery's rage. Candy Montgomery's murder trial began in October of 1980, barely 4 months after the slaying in McKinley, Texas. The seat of the government for Collin County, Judge Tom Ryan anticipated a vast interest by the media and public, so he ordered the recently shuttered 100-year-old county courthouse to be reopened for the event because it was the largest courthouse in the county. It seated 250 people. Ryan was a plain-spoken judge who known for his running brisk proceedings. Sorry about that. He did not lollygag, and he didn't like smart aleck lawyers. Ryan and Dawn were at odds from the get-go. On the first day of trial, the judge found Crowler by attempted defaming his ban against speaking to the media. So basically, the judge said that they weren't allowed to talk to the media. They weren't going to let the evidence or their opinions come out because it was such a high-profile case. Now, Crowler wasn't short of being shy of confrontation or being snippy, and this continued throughout the entire trial. Crowler's advisor was Tom O'Callaghan, a district attorney for Collin County. Although he was just 39, Callahan had served 9 years in this position. He was regarded as competent and courtly, unlike Dawn, rarely confrontational. During jury selection, Crowler calmly and cleverly used 4 sentences to sum up his case before the 62 potential members of the panel would be decided. Candy Montgomery killed Betty Gore. He said slowly. She did so with an axe. She did so in self-defense. The homicide was justified. He reinforced this message during his open statement after 12 men and women were selected for the panel, and he promised that Candy Montgomery would mount the witness stand and explain it all. This served to reduce the prosecutor's 5-day presentation to a preface. Now, the prosecutor and his colleague Jack, were the opening act. They presented a workmanlike case seeking to prove that Candy did kill Betty, but Crowler had already admitted that, so what was the point? Everyone in the courtroom was impatient for the prosecutors to clear the stage to make way for Candy, the star of the show. And when it started, he stunned everyone with the declaration that his client would plead self-defense. And when Candy was called to the stand as a witness, seats for that day's proceeding were hotter than the season passes to the Dallas Cowboys game in Texas. The courtroom was quiet. Now, Candy looked sober and disassociated. Crowder had been explicit about what she was going to wear. Her hair was short and wavy. She wore earrings and loose-fitting blue dress, dark and subtle with a hemline that was well below her knees. Over her shoulders, she draped a white woolen sweater, and in spite of Crowler's coaching, though, Candy was less than a model witness. Her voice was clipped and nasal, and her manner was cool. As Crowler questioned her about her children, her upbringing, her community and church activities, her friends with the Gore, Candy gave short, functional answers. She sounded like a stuffy schoolmar, overemphasizing her sentences and bashing all emotion from her voice. The story she told not sprung spontaneous from a conscious memory. 2 months before the trial, most of the facts of the case and what actually happened inside the utility room remained unknown. Dr. Fred had changed that all in 3 long, wrenching hypnosis sessions, and after each one, Candy had repeated the events of the 13th to Crowler. Whether or not her conscious story conflicted with her unconscious story, Crowler confronted her with the lie and forced her to admit the facts she would rather have forgotten. From those sessions, the best possible reconstruction of the killing of Betty Gore emerged. She wasn't expecting Candy until noon, so when Betty responded to the polite knock that morning, she was a little annoyed. No doubt, she had just sat down for the first time that day to rest, after putting Bethany in her crib for a mid-morning nap. She had hurried to the door so the sound wouldn't wake the baby, and Betty had a half-finished cup of coffee, and from behind came the muffled sound of the Phil Donahue show. Since she hadn't intended to go out that day, she was dressed for housework, tight-fitted red denim shorts, a yellow short-sleeve pullover, and sandals. She opened the front door and peered out. "Betty, I have a special favor to ask you." Candy was not long in greetings, but no one minded her abruptness. The friendliness in her eyes and smile was a greet alone. "The girls want Alyssa to go see the movie with us tonight, and I told them if it's okay with you, it's okay with me, and I'd be happy to take Alyssa to her swimming lessons to save you the extra trip." "That's okay," Betty said. "Come on in." "I thought it would be," said Candy, "so I just ran down from Bible school to get Alyssa's swimsuit." The two women walked into the living room, which, dominated by a large playpen in the middle of the room with toys and children's books, were scattered around. Betty switched off the television and went to the kitchen. "Want some coffee?" "No, thanks." Candy sat next to the sewing machine where she noticed that Betty was making something out of yellow cloth. Betty came back and sat on the other side of the small table. She seemed tense, as though she was anxious for Candy to leave. "So where's Bethany?" Candy asked. "Bethany got up very early today, so she just went back to bed." "Oh no," Candy said, frowning. "I wanted to play with her." "Candy, if you're going to take Alyssa to swimming lessons, remember that she doesn't like to put her face underwater," Betty said. "So when she puts her face underwater, be sure to give her a peppermint afterwards. That's the reward we use." Betty was loosening up a little. As the small talk was welcoming, it was interrupted by the morning chores, and it was a little annoying, but they chatted for a while. Then Candy glanced at her watch. "Well, it's getting late and I have to run some errands. You want to get me Alyssa's soup?" Betty didn't stir from her chair. Her face was blank, her eyes were unfocused. "Candy," she said calmly, "are you having an affair with Alan?" Candy was stunned. "No, of course not," she answered, a little too quick, and Betty squinted and seemed to creep in her tone. "But you did, didn't you?" "Yes," Candy said quietly, "but it was a long time ago." Candy was still, and her eyes avoided Betty's. Betty said nothing, staring past Candy's head, transfixed. "Did Alan tell you?" Candy looked into Betty's face for a sign. "Wait a minute," Betty said, and she rose abruptly from her chair and walked through the open door of the utility room and out of sight. Candy wondered how recently Betty found out. Candy also realized with quite panic that she had nothing to say to her. After a few seconds, Betty reappeared in the doorway, her face tense, and she was clenching the curved wooden handle of a 3-foot axe, the kind used for chopping heavy firewood. Her stance, oddly enough, wasn't very threatening, since she held the axe clumsily, away from her body, the blade pointed towards the floor. Candy was more worried about what Betty would say than what she would do. Candy stood up but didn't move from the chair. "Betty, don't see him again," Betty said. It was an order. Under the circumstances, Candy said, "I think I'm just going to bring Alyssa home and drop her off right after Bible school." "No," said Betty harshly. "I don't want to see you anymore. Just keep Alyssa and take her to the movies because I don't want to look at you, and bring her home tomorrow." Betty laid the axe against the wall just inside the living room and walked past Candy into the middle of the living room. "I'll get a towel from the bathroom," she said over her shoulder. "You get Alyssa's swimsuit off the washer." All Candy wanted to do was get out of the house because she suddenly had a sick feeling in the pit of her stomach. As she took the swimsuit off the washer, Betty reappeared behind her. "Don't forget Alyssa's peppermints." The tone was soft now, more reassuring. The two women met in the utility room door, and Betty handed the towel to Candy. "That's okay," Candy said. "I have some peppermints at home I can give her." Betty reached into the candy bowl by the fireplace. "I'll give you a few of these anyway." As Candy stuffed the swimsuit and the towel into her handbag, Betty gave her a handful of candies, and she dropped those in as well. When Candy looked up at last, Betty was staring at her, but her expression was no longer one of rage. Her face was filled with pain. Candy thought of how Betty would cry after she left and felt a stab of conscience. Both women hesitated as though something important was going to settle by the tone of them parting. Clumsily, Candy placed her hand on Betty's arm. When she spoke, her voice dripped with pity. "Oh, Betty, I'm so sorry." And all at once, Betty's rage erupted. She flung the hand off of her and shoved Candy backwards into the utility room. Betty grabbed the axe resting by the doorway and rushed in after her, holding it like a weapon, diagonally across her chest. See, the blade was still pointed at the floor, but she was screaming, "You can't have him." and she crowded Candy. "You can't have him. I'm going to have a baby, and you can't have him this time." "Betty, don't," said Candy, putting her hand on the axe as Betty moved in. "This is stupid. I don't want Alan." For the moment, neither of the women moved. They grabbed the axe firmly, their eyes locked. Then Betty began to jerk the axe, trying to control it. "Betty, don't do this," Candy pleaded. "Please stop." "I've got to kill you," Betty spoke slowly. As they grabbed for control, Betty wrenched the axe violently and jerked it upward. The flat side of the blade slapped against Candy's side of her head, bobbing her head back. "Betty, what are you doing?" Candy stepped backwards farther into the utility room, grabbing her head with her hand. "Betty, stop." Candy looked at her. It was streaking blood down, and she looked back at Betty, and then she saw her raise the blade over her head, almost to the 8-foot ceiling, as though it was going to smash her with one single powerful blow. Candy screamed at the top of her lungs, a high-pitched pleading sound, and jumped sideways to a cabinet, spilling the books and knickknacks on the floor. Even though Candy had no place to hide, Betty was between Candy and both of the exits with the axe, and she missed her entirely, landing harmlessly on the floor. Now the blade made a dull thud, bounced once, and then slid to Candy's toe, slashing it. Just as it did, Candy grabbed the blade, wrapping her fingers around the thick, heavy metal. Her now pleading turned to anger. She said, "No more." The exaggerated blow and the drawing of blood unloosing the string freeing both women. As soon as Candy grabbed the blade, Betty started shoving and jerking the handle, but Candy held on tight. The struggle ended up turning into a wrestling match. Betty thrust and dragged the axe and Candy's body, and then she kicked with both of her legs, kneeling her into the thighs. Now, Candy responded by jerking the handle out of Betty's hands. From the distance, a kind of frenzy came. The Gore's dogs in the back made a high-pitched barking noise. Betty moved her hands up the handle, trying to get leverage. Finally, she bit Candy on the knuckle. With her head bent, Betty was off balance, and Candy shoved the axe against Betty's body with all of her might. Betty reeled backwards and fell against the door of the freezer, her feet slipping on the little floor, and Candy didn't hesitate. As Betty struggled to regain her balance, her body facing away, Candy brought the axe up with both hands and brought the blade down on the back of Betty's head. The blow sounded with a hollow pop like a cork coming out of a wine bottle, and then blood gushed across the back of Betty's neck. Candy dropped the axe, jumped away from Betty, and felt in a time that everything shifted into slow motion. Betty began to slump down towards the floor, blood pooling out of her skull, and she continued to struggle to her feet. Terrified by the blood, and certain that she just killed her, Candy bolted for the living room door, but it seemed like eternity passed before she was able to reach it. She finally put her hand on the knob, starting to pull, and Betty slammed her body across the door. Candy looked up and saw blood spewing across the side of Betty's face. Betty picked up the axe again, like some nightmare version of a corpse that stalked its prey. Tears sprouted out of Candy's eyes. The barking of the dogs, their primal growl grew louder. "Let me go, Betty. Please let me go." Betty's voice came from 1,000 miles away. "I can't." Candy grabbed the axe again, and the woman began dancing around the utility room, once again jabbing and pushing the axe that hung between them. Betty's head was dripping with blood until the floor was so silk with crimson. They circled endlessly, losing their grip, and then regaining it before she can be shoved away. At one point, Betty bumped up against the freezer again. Candy, removing her hand from the axe, grabbed the knob of the door. She pulled the door open a few inches, but then Betty managed to struggle her position, shoving her away, slamming it shut, and pushing the locking on the door. They kicked each other again. Their shoes squeaked across the red floor. Above the steady electrical hum of the washing machine, they grunted and breathed heavily. Betty grabbed Candy's hair with one hand. Then Candy slipped on the blood and went down hard directly in front of the freezer. As she did, Betty tried to raise the axe, but she was growing weak from the loss of blood and couldn't get up this time. Candy tackled her by one leg, and Betty sprawled forward almost at the top of Candy. By the time they were up again, the axe was between them, and they fought over it in sitting positions. Candy shoved Betty hard, jumping to her feet and lunging at the garage door. but the knob wouldn't turn. She pivoted as Betty moved towards her. "Betty, don't," she said. "Please let me go. I don't want him. I don't want him." Betty's eyes flared in a final rage, but her reply was eerily restrained. Placing one finger on her lip and gripping the axe with her other hand, she breathed something deep in her throat. "Shh." The words echoed through Candy's subconscious like a psych alarm. She grabbed the axe and used it aggressively, pushing the handle against Betty's leg. Through a window came the hysteric canine sounds, desperate now, the bark and the howl of the frightening creatures. Candy jerked the axe and then leaned backwards with all of her might, wrapping both hands around the blade. The handle was covered with blood, and when Betty tried to pull just as hard as she could, as though the tug of war, her hand slipped off and she fell backwards into the room. She wouldn't stay down, though. She lunged towards Candy, but Candy had time to raise the axe and bring it down with all the adrenaline-filled strength she could gather. There was no pity, no remorse, nothing. It was all now going to be Candy destroying Betty out of pure, unadulterated hate, anger of what this woman had done to her, the rage that now her life might change because of the stupid woman. Candy stopped at the point of pure, utter exhaustion. There were all 41 chop wounds. 40 occurred while Betty Gore's heart was still beating. The courtroom went silent. Candy Montgomery's voice had barely risen above the traffic noise from the square. Crowder continued his questioning, but Candy lapsed into her monotone again. While describing the struggle, her cheeks trembled and she sobbed silently. But now she recovered her composure. Crowder feared that her testimony seemed too rehearsed. "When you went over there," he said, "did you mean to kill her with the axe?" "No." Crowder picked up the axe and placed it on his right hip. Time for a bootleg play, he thought. "But you did kill her with the axe, didn't you?" he said. He walked towards the witness booth. "Yes. This axe, right here. Don't make me look at it." He grabbed the axe with both hands, brought it up into full view, and thrust it into Candy's face. "Don't! You killed her with this axe right here, didn't you?" Pat Montgomery could hear Candy's screams in the witness room 30 yards away. Candy burst into tears and seemed to rise out of her chair. "You killed her with this axe right here, didn't you?" "Yes," she said, so he would take it away. One of the women juries dabbed her reddened eyes with a tissue. Another one squirmed in her seat, offended by the cheap trick. She too wondered why Candy seemed so cold and impersonal, but felt sympathy, oddly, for her. Her story hung together. It didn't seem to whitewash. How can she be so sure? She wanted the prosecutor to be tough, pry open every part of the story and find one line in it that would make it come apart. Crowder led Candy through the rest of her day and had her admit to all the cover-ups and the invasion of the following week as she tried to avoid detection. After a 10-minute recess, prosecution took a deep breath and plunged in. This is all that he was afraid of. Candy was intelligent, attractive, direct, handled herself well, and she used every possible explanation she could. I freaked out. He would probe her in her story, trying to pick out the faults, the lies. He stuck to his original plan and tried to expose the cracks in her story. He asked Candy to repeat her account of what happened in the utility room, but with much less detail. She didn't hesitate. There was no lies. She even added small details like the location of the peppermint candies in the glass bowl on the shelf next to the fireplace. It was the kind of thing that a blade-faced liar wouldn't know. Now the prosecution questions wandered from place to place, from the utility room to the friend's divorce, back to the cover-ups. He emphasized that a year-old baby had been left alone by this woman who prided herself on motherhood. He pointed out that Candy's lies repeated to her friends and then abruptly stopped. "You may sit down." Candy's testimony ended on Friday, and that following Wednesday, the jury heard the final arguments and reached its verdict by that same afternoon. Candy Montgomery was found not guilty. The violent death was protected underneath Texas's Stand Your Ground law, which permitted the use of deadly force if necessary to prevent a crime, such as Betty's violent threats against Candy. At the end, the victim's father said, "As far as I'm concerned, justice was served. She has to live with it. I wouldn't say I was happy with the verdict. We don't know what happened, and we never will know what happened." Now, most people want to know where Candy is now. Candy seemed to have achieved her wishes of normalcy. Candy and Pat stayed together after the trial and moved out of Texas to escape the lingering spotlight, though some reports indicated that they have gotten divorced. Today, per People, Candy's living in Georgia, where she works as a mental health counselor. Alyssa, Bethany, that were Betty and Alan's 2 daughters, started a new chapter in their lives by moving from Texas to Kansas. The sisters were adopted by their maternal grandparents, Bob and Bertha, in 1988. The adoption came at the request of Mr. Gore, who was moving his new wife and family from Dallas to California. They felt like their marriage had a better shot at working if Bethany and I weren't around, their daughter said. Now, Alyssa, commonly known as Lisa, graduated from Northwich High School in 1992 and now resides in Kansas. At Kansas State University, she pursued her higher education, concentrating on earning an accounting degree. She holds the most esteemed position of business controller, but I'm not going to disclose the location of her employment for security purposes. Later, Lissa married John, becoming a proud mother of 2 boys. On the other hand, Bethany continued her studies and decided to enter the era of education like her mother. She is currently employed as an assistant principal. She married a man named Chad, and they have since devoted themselves to their family. She has 3 children, one of which is named after her mother. Mr. Gore married the former Elaine Cliff less than 3 months after Mrs. Montgomery's trial was done, where she got off scot-free, and the family then moved away from the area. The first few years of her father's second marriage were difficult for the sisters. Lisa was in and out of therapy as a preteen, and she said that there was a lot of times that her dad and Elaine would withhold food as punishment. Lisa said that when she was 10 years old, her stepmother made her read Evidence of Love, the true crime book that detailed her father's affair and her mother's death. I had to give her a little summary after each chapter. One of Lisa's earliest memories is being punished by standing in a cold shower with her foot in the tub of ice cubes. My stepmother told us if we said anything about their treatment, they would separate us. I've seen neither of them in 15 years. Elaine and Alan Gore are divorced, and the sister's former stepmother is a college music teacher in the Northeast United States. She refuses to respond to any of the questions about her relationship with the 2 girls. A dispute over their grandparents' visitation rights ended them up in court in Dallas before it was resolved. Once Betty's father said Bethany arrived for a visit with tufts of her hair missing. I told Alan that if that little girl comes back with any more hairs pulled out, I'll take you down and pull out every single one of your hairs, he said. Mr. Gore was living in California and didn't respond to numerous phone calls of a letter requesting remarks about his daughters and their grandfather. So basically, what happened was 2 decades after the murder, there was an interview, and the interviewer was trying to get questions. And at that time, Alan Gore was working in California. And in this interview, that's what I'm going to go through in a minute. It's very disturbing of what happened, how it happened, and all of that. The way that he reacted to his daughters afterwards and everything. It's heartbreaking. As of 2023, it has now been 4 decades, 43 years since the murder of Betty Gore. But this article came out 20 years ago. For Betty's daughters, there are matters still to be disclosed. 20 years ago, with testimony about adultery and pools of blood, about repressed memories and tired marriages, the children drew sympathy but a little outside attention. In young adulthood, they wanted to say they managed to turn out all right, despite some rough early years. Long estranged from their father, they talked about how nice it would be to have their mother around. They're curious about Miss Montgomery. They wonder, I just want to know what really happened, because no one knows but her. But Miss Montgomery does not wish to reveal her thoughts regarding it either then or now. I'm telling you in big, bold letters, Miss Montgomery said, I'm not interested. The sisters have not seen their father in years, even though they get occasional greeting cards from him signed Alan. When Lisa got married in 1996, he was not invited. Bethany said she wouldn't come if he was there. Betty's father still harbors anger towards Mr. Gore, and a part of a conversation that he had with his son-in-law shortly after his daughter's death. I said, "You don't show any remorse," he recalled. He said, "It doesn't bother me very much. We weren't getting along anyways." A lot of anger. Perhaps most of the ill will is still directed at Miss Montgomery. My family holds a lot of anger and a lot of hatred towards her, Lisa said, adding that she prefers not to dwell on it. You can spend your whole life hating someone. Instead, She tries to remember her mother. I talk to her once in a while. I kind of always feel like she's here with me and my son. She said, my husband says it's too bad your mom couldn't see him, but in my mind, she probably sees him every day. Again, the talk turned back to loss. What angers me is, she said, is all I can think about is what could have been. Even if their mother had lived, the daughters say that doesn't mean that they would have enjoyed a happy life in Texas. I know mom and dad would have gotten a divorce. I think she would have left him and we would have moved back to Kansas. She smiled in a distinct look. That would have been perfect. Now, 20 years after that interview, almost 40 years after the murder of Betty Gore, Alan Gore seems to be back in touch with his daughters based off of his recent post on Facebook. Alan currently resides in Sarasota, Florida, and is now retired and involved in another relationship. That is the final episode of the Betty Gore case. I got a little tongue-tied there at the very end trying to read from that article. I think what the daughters had to go through after their mother was murdered at such a young age, and then to deal with an evil stepmother and a father that just kind of gave up on them, it was hard to get through. The case itself, I think, is one of the prime reasons why when you get married, just stay freaking faithful. I know that Candace Montgomery got off on self-defense charges, but as I went through this case and everything, and even though that she reacted when her and Alan broke up, I feel like some of those swings, some of that aggression came out because he chose her. We don't know what happened, and no one ever will, because Betty's gone and Candy has said her piece of what she says happens. But I do believe that 43 years later, it's a trauma that will forever rock that city, that town, that community, and all the people in it. I did read somewhere that Candy's lawyer ended up committing suicide about 20 years ago or so. And they speculate it's from this case. Obviously, that's not facts. We don't know that. This case was crazy, and we had to break it down into 4 parts. And if you haven't watched the docu-series, I highly suggest you do. That brings us to the end of this episode. As always, thank you for listening to Murder by Nature. If you enjoyed our show, please rate us and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any platform that you're currently on. And be sure to come back next Monday for a new episode. Until then, I am your host. Don't forget to stay safe. Don't get murdered or murder people, you lovely humans.